Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Long Kiss Goodnight from 1996. So, The Long Kiss Goodnight. This is a movie that I cannot remember the first time I heard about it, but I don't hear about it much. And honestly, I'm kind of not sure how most people would. It's a weirdly broad movie in terms of its potential appeal and the genre that it sits in, but it's also buried under an avalanche of other movies that mean that anything it does to potentially stand out are either accidentally or deliberately buried under the pile of other 80s and 90s mostly sort of action genre flicks. The 80s and 90s were a weird time for action movies, especially the 90s, as we saw with Speed. There's just a lot of weird shit that went on in terms of what scripts are selling, how goofy is the premise, how over the top is the action and these other things, and who's on the billing, right? So The Long Kiss Goodnight slips under the radar, I think, pretty easily. It's apparently known as a bit of a cult classic film. I don't know how true that is. Again, I've barely ever heard anyone speak about it. But it's got some unusual things on offer, which are gonna be I think the focus of part of the discussion here. This does have Samuel L. Jackson as one of the co-stars, air quotes, but in all seriousness, he's a sidekick to Gina Davis as the lead. And that's why this fits in a particularly weird space, is because even though 1996 wasn't insanely long ago, and I think people these days tend to think of the 90s as being a somewhat enlightened age, the idea of a woman in a leading role was still not really a big thing. I mean, it's sort of not really a thing even now. I mean, obviously we've had all the hullabaloo about the big things like the MCU and having leading female roles in that and those sorts of things. It's still a big discussion that's going on. So when I sometimes hear people be like, oh yeah, we had lots of women in the 90s, it's like, did we? Did we? Because part of the reason this movie probably didn't do super well was because, one, it had a woman in a leading role and it got some stigma off of that, but also the marketing surrounding it is pretty bad. It tries to de-emphasize a lot of that aspect of it. And that's not me suggesting that it needs to emphasize that, just that it needs to not deliberately hide or be confused about what it should be presenting as the PR aspect of it. So part of the reason this probably got made is because Gina Davis at the time was married to Renny Harlin, the director. Renny Harlin has quite a prolific history making mostly sort of B movies and those sorts of things. This was not dramatically into his career. He sort of started making stuff in Hollywood in the 80s. I think prior to this, Die Hard 2 might be the biggest thing with his name on it. But he's got a variety of credits to his name. Obviously, he was doing well enough to continue getting funding, despite the fact that I think less than a year before, he made Cutthroat Island, also starring his wife, Gina Davis, which is generally known as one of the the worst performing films of all time, making less than 10% of its budget back, I believe. So that also is alleged to be one of the reasons why this movie may not have performed as well. It's impossible to say, but yeah. So, what is this film? It's essentially an action film. There's a lot of things I could compare it to, obviously, within the genre and without it. Not only at the time, but things that would come later. So, it's a story about... it's not the story I expected. I think I should sort of lead off with that. The framing device used to encapsulate the overall story is not what I expected and is dramatically de-emphasized in all the marketing. In some ways, I would have preferred the movie I was expecting. In other ways, I'm glad it's something different. This is not just another 90s action film, but it keeps to a lot of the same cinematic tendencies and the sort of genre conventions of action and spy movies of that era. However, overall, it's got kind of a weird tone where it's not entirely sure where to land. That is despite having a generally pretty good script. The script is by Shane Black, who I have my feelings on, ups and downs. He's does some good work and some not so good work, and obviously more recently has been had his hands in the MCU a little bit, so his name's been circulated a bit more. But this was allegedly, this script allegedly sold for like $3 million and was the highest pay for a script ever sold in Hollywood at the time. And that's not entirely without reason. The script is very good. It is a generally, I don't want to say it's well constructed because there are some structural problems, but how much of that was in the original script, it's a little hard to say. As far as the dialogue that's delivered, the overall how a shot-to-shot and even some of the scene-to-scene stuff works, it works really well. And I appreciate the amount of characterization and just sort of good atmosphere that's developed as a result of script choices. That said, I think it's somewhat done a disservice by the genre conventions of the time, where it is a struggle between some of the intentions of the script versus the expectations of the director and the presumed expectations of the audience to capitalize on certain script elements in ways they weren't meant to be seen. I know that's sort of vague, but I'm trying not to spoil things. Where scenes that are sort of, you can feel the intention of the scene, but it's executed in a more typical action scene way, in a way that sort of dumbs down the overall effect of the script. It's not pervasive throughout the entire film, but there's more than a few moments that are like that. And unfortunately, the majority of them are in the leading portion of the film. Going in the first like 20 or 30 minutes, I started to get concerned that we were off to a bad start. Not that it didn't have its own merits, but that it was sort of struggling to find footing. And that's because structurally it's got a few issues. At about the hour mark, I paused the film and went, okay, we're like pretty close to the end, right? And no, it's just getting started. And that's really weird because the pacing is pretty consistent overall. The scene to scene tempo feels appropriate for a film that is maybe an hour and 20 minutes long instead of a movie that's 2 hours long. That said, that's not to say that the last 40 minutes aren't like deserved or that it stretches out unnecessarily. If anything, it recontextualizes that first, hour of the film and sort of it raises some questions about what that first 20 to 30 minutes is really supposed to execute on. With this being a female-led action film, and with some of the themes that it's trying to tackle, it does require, I think, some more explanation than the typical action film of the 80s and 90s, where usually it's flavor A, B, or C of burly man doing burly man job put into burly man action scenario and go. And that can all be established very quickly. However, the script has a greater ambitions for what it can do with describing the character, and overall delivers on more than just action hero wins the day. There are some very overt underlying themes about the Gina Davis's character's struggle with a dichotomy between multiple sides of her life. Some of them are literal and some of them are metaphorical. In certain ways, I feel like the film is way ahead of its time in terms of trying to grapple with themes about women in a society that doesn't look at women as necessarily being equals or fulfilling certain roles, or not being just presumptions about what women can and can't do. There's also like an interrogation about the ideas of motherhood and whether or not having kids as a woman makes you capable of doing other things, or if that sort of defines your character after that point. There's a whole bunch of other themes that I think are really interesting in that same sort of vein that all tie really nicely in together. Unfortunately, where it sort of falls off for me is that this is still couched in a 1996 or generally 80s and 90s script, where either for reasons of genre convention or for reasons of the, society at the time, some of the delivery is to modernize is iffy. And I struggled a little bit thinking about this film, because it's one thing to say, well, it was the 90s. And I don't like those kinds of arguments. The arguments that say, oh, well, it was a different time, so they didn't know better, those sorts of things. This movie doesn't have that problem exactly. It's more like it doesn't have the social wherewithal to talk about the things it wants to talk about. It's very ambitious, but is too tied down to the 90s action thriller spy thing to really, really do a hardcore interrogation of some of the things it touches on. There are enough elements towards the latter half that reinforce that sort of feeling of this is an action film, remember, that I don't want to blame that entirely on directorship or production, like executive production or anything like that. It's sort of core to the script. But I think Shane Black has had good intentions, and there's nothing so overt or offensive or problematic in any way that I can think of that can't be forgiven. It's just somewhat unsubtle to a modern viewership. As far as the tone, it sort of, as a result, kind of swings back and forth, where it goes from some level of hardcore 90s action scene to trying to be somewhat more contemplative and more character driven, which is a little bit less, less common in the genre. And so trying to feel the bumps, the up and downs of scene to scene can sometimes not transition super well. I think overall it smooths out and sort of synergizes better by the end. And it could even be argued that some of that might be deliberate in terms of trying to emphasize some of the struggles going on for the characters. But overall, it makes for a somewhat less pleasant viewing experience and somewhat disengaging because of some of the jar. It can be kind of jarring to have some of those transitions. Overall, like I said, I think the script and the story and all of it comes together pretty well. It's not really extraordinary, but when I do a comparison to other 90s, 80s, and 90s action films, whether it's Die Hard 2 or Speed or any number of the others, while it is not as tight, and it's not so much, inherently, because it's it's more ambitious in what it's addressing. It's sort of a bumpier ride, but that doesn't, if I have to take a step back and say, well, which ones are the better films? This really suddenly bumps up in its quality by virtue of having those ambitions, I think. To say that, Die Hard, it's been ages since I've seen Die Hard 2, but I think this is a better movie than Die Hard 2. It's in multiple ways, both in its ambition and overall execution is probably better. But it's the kind of thing that makes me think even though I didn't adore this movie, that I'm going to have to come back and rewatch it and rethink about where it stands in terms of the movie culture of the time, as well as, the culture of the 90s. With Gina Davis and Samuel L. Jackson, I have to say they're both pretty excellent. They're not without their flaws. Samuel L. Jackson doesn't actually, I have to give special credit to him, not for putting on an incredible performance, but actually for stepping it back a bit. He pretty clearly plays his character not as a co-star, but as sort of a sidekick. And it works really, really well. He is, at this time, a pretty decently big name and was probably cast in no small part for that. But his ability to make sure there is room for him not to be, the primary character. The fact that he is, not trying to take over for Gina Davis's character very much, I think is a credit both to the script of trying to, be sure that he's not overshadowing, but also to him for sort of the way he plays the character as a secondary. Gina Davis, meanwhile, has a hell of a time playing essentially, a character with a lot of facets that have to be juggled all at the same time. And she flips between them in a way that I think is sometimes a little bit jarring, but generally pretty well executed and meaningful, as her character struggles with a variety of different sort of internal conflicts. And overall, I think she has some really extraordinary scenes where she really, it's extraordinarily believable. I am not super familiar with her filmography. My impression is that she did pretty well for a while. I don't remember. I'm trying to remember. Let's just see here. I mean, she certainly had, she had a bunch of movies before this, so she was not, not small time before this either. But before and after, not a terrible career by any means. Compared to some of the other sort of female action heroes of the 80s and 90s, she certainly is less iconic for this role, but I think deserves probably more credit than she gets. Again, I don't really hear people talk about this film much, so maybe I can, with this video, encourage somebody to go watch it. The overall cinematography doesn't do a lot for me. It's a very 90s action looking film. And if you've seen other 90s action films, you sort of know what I mean already. There's a certain style to the camera movement, to the lighting, to the, the shots as they're chosen, to the rhythm of the cutting, to the editing and stuff, that all feels very 90s action film. But that it's not without its moments of excellence. There's a few moments that look really great cinematography-wise. However, there are also more than a few moments, especially in high action scenes, which are... I don't think I can credit this to being deliberate, because tonally it's not a comedy. It's not an action comedy, really. So there are some very high-octane action films that are really brought down by some poorly aged green screening and CGI, and just some absurd action moments that make absolutely no sense and do not seem to be tongue-in-cheek either. Maybe a little, but the film's not funny enough to really cash in on those. So that they're a little bit, they're not terrible, but they're a little bit jarring. If you've seen the film before, you probably know a few of them. On the other hand, there is one towards the end that I think is bombastically cheesy and poorly executed, and yet works really well. So it's not all bad by any means. And there's enough good sort of action scenes, combat choreography that, it's not disruptive. It's not just pure cheese with no payoff either. So credit where it's due there. Overall, the thing is definitely dated. Whether it's because of the way it's shot, the effects that are used, some of the aspects of the script, the people who are in it, or just sort of the genre conventions that have changed, that changed not long thereafter. This sort of escapes the like gritty late '90s action stuff that would proliferate after that and into the 2000s. But it's definitely dated, though not necessarily in a bad way. Overall, I'm definitely glad I watched it. It's a unique film that I haven't seen the likes of. It's an interesting divergence from those 80s and 90s standbys as far as action goes. It's not really extraordinary in any particular way, but I admire its tenacity and its ambition, like I said before. So, if you have an interest in, if you enjoy those 80s and 90s action films, absolutely, I think you should watch it both as a complement and as a contrast. And if you're just looking for something to throw on that's a little bit punchy, a little bit cheesy, and a little bit different, I don't think you could. I don't think you'd be wasting your time watching it for that either. So, yeah, not a huge recommendation, but I recommend you check it out. I'm gonna come back and watch it again at some point, I'm sure. It's just, yeah, it's given me a lot to think about, and it fits in a weird place in a place and time in cinematic history as well. So I'm gonna keep thinking about it, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.